to another video tutorial. Today I'm going to show you how to sew this oversized shirt called Bill. You can choose between 3 different lengths. The longest is long enough to cover your butt and is perfect to pair with leggings. Then there is a medium length and a cropped length. The sleeves are short and reach your elbow. Then there is one patch pocket, a regular 2-piece collar and a regular button placket. The fit is oversized, but if you know my oversized shirt Carl, then this one is way smaller. It is not as oversized. It's basically a very simplified pattern. It's basically like a t-shirt with a button placket and a collar. The shoulder points are right at the shoulder, while at my Carl shirt the shoulders are dropped. Regarding the difficulty, shirts, especially the collar, is not the easiest and not the most beginner-friendliest pattern. But as always in my tutorials, I'm showing every step very detailed, and I am convinced that if you are a confident beginner and you just follow every step, you will be able to make it. If you're a beginner, I would recommend to use a fabric which is easy to work with, such as a plain cotton woven fabric or a linen, because these are easy to work with and the color is difficult. So easy fabric and difficult construction is better than a slippery fabric and a difficult construction. You only need a normal sewing machine to sew this. I will use my overlocker to finish the raw seams, but you can also finish the raw seams with your regular sewing machine and a large zigzag stitch instead. This pattern was drafted for woven fabrics. You can use cotton fabrics, linen, viscose, satin, double gauze, tencel, any blends like viscose linen, cotton viscose, whatever you want. If you're using double gauze like I used here, I would always recommend to press the fabric before you cut, because this fabric is prone to stretch and it might happen that the neck stretches out and your collar stand will not, because we're going to reinforce it, and in that case the collar stand and the neck won't match anymore, and for that reason it's important to pre-press the fabric, especially fabrics like this, to avoid that. Apart from the fabric, you will need buttons with a diameter of around 1.2 centimeters. You will need 5 pieces for the cropped and medium length and 6 pieces for the long length. Last but not least, we are going to fuse some fusible interfacing to our collar stand and the button placket, and therefore you will need a little piece of interfacing. I'm using H180 or H200. Here is an overview of all the pieces that you will need. The back is being cut on the fold. You will only need 1 pocket, and all the other pieces are being cut twice, so that we have a mirrored pair of each. Transfer all the markings that are located right at the edge to the fabric with a little notch. Mark the center of your back piece at the neck with a little notch too. Transfer the position of the patch pocket to one of your front pieces on the right fabric side using a soluble pen. I usually only cut out the corners and transfer the corners. Now we only need to mark the position of the buttonholes and buttons. I usually push pins through the ends of the buttonhole markings, and then I can simply connect those 2 points. Repeat this step with all the buttonholes, and then you can remove the pattern and pin both front pieces together so they cannot shift anymore. And then repeat these steps with the markings that you have just made to mark the position on the other front piece as well. The buttonholes are being marked on the right fabric side using a soluble pen. If your fabric looks the same from both sides, wrong and right side, I always recommend to put 2 pins to the right fabric side of your fabric. Simply place both front pieces and the sleeves with right fabric sides facing up so that they are laying mirrored, and then put 2 pins into the fabric. Next, I'm pressing interfacing to one of the collar pieces and one of the collar stands as well. I always use parchment paper at the top and bottom to protect my ironing board and iron. The interfacing is always being pressed to the wrong fabric side, and for this shirt I'm using a lightweight interfacing like H180 or H200. As you can see, I always cut the interfacing out roughly, press it on, and then I will cut it out neatly. Also reinforced the center front edge with a 6 cm wide strip of interfacing to reinforce the button placket. I also use parchment paper here to protect my ironing board and iron, and the interfacing should reach up to the second marking at the front piece. Next, we're going to sew the button placket. There are two methods to do it. If you can press your fabric, I would recommend the first method, which I'm showing here. And if your fabric is made of polyester or isn't easy to press, I would recommend the other method, which I show in the next clip. First, fold and press the front edge 6 cm to the wrong fabric side right at the second marking. Then unfold it and press the raw edge right to the crease. You are now folding and pressing 3 cm to the wrong fabric side, and then fold it one last time and press it nice and flat. You have now folded and pressed it twice 3 cm to the inside, so that's a total of 6 cm. If you cannot press your fabric, simply fold it twice 3 cm to the wrong fabric side and pin everything in place. If you have only pressed your front edges, I would recommend to put a few pins in here to secure it. In both cases, the front edges have been folded twice 3 cm to the wrong fabric side, and now we are going to stitch. I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and a distance from the edge of around 2.8 centimeters. For this seam, I like to pull at the front and at the back to help my sewing machine transport the fabric, and the right side of my shirt is facing up. Next, I'm going to stitch one more time right at the front edge with a little distance of around 2 millimeters so that this button placket looks nice and neat. Repeat these steps with the other front piece as well, and then press the button plackets nice and flat. Now take your pocket piece and finish the raw edges all the way around. I'm using my overlocker, but you can also use a large zigzag stitch instead, and then pin the top edge of the pocket, which is one of the shorter ones, 2 centimeters to the wrong fabric side. Pin everything in place, and then I'm going to stitch along this seam with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Next, pin the remaining 3 edges 1.5 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. We have already stitched across the top edge, so you only need to pin along the sides and the bottom. Now take your front piece on which you have put the pocket marking and pin the pocket right into the marking to the right fabric side. Pin the pocket to the front piece along the sides and along the bottom. We are leaving the top open because this is the pocket opening. Next, I'm going to stitch in a U shape using a small distance of around 2 millimeters to the pocket edge, stitching right on the pocket. And once you have reached the corner, leave your needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, rotate your fabric by 90 degrees and continue sewing. By leaving the needle in the fabric, nothing can shift and you will get nice and sharp corners. Last but not least, press the patch pocket nice and flat. For the side and shoulder seam, place both front pieces right fabric sides facing on the back piece. As you can see, the front armhole is shorter than the back armhole, which is normal. We will not stitch the armhole close as we're going to insert a sleeve, and then simply pin along the sides and along the shoulders on both sides. This is what it will look like, and now I'm going to stitch across the sides and the shoulders. I'm using a 1 centimeter seam allowance and my regular sewing machine with a regular straight stitch. And once I've stitched all those seams, I'm going to finish the seams using my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, you can simply finish the seams with a zigzag stitch instead. That's what it should look like, and for a professional finish I'm going to press my seam allowance at the sides and at the shoulders towards the back right into the back piece. And now place both sleeve pieces mirrored with right fabric sides facing up, and now fold them lengthwise with right fabric sides facing and pin them together along the sleeve seams. Once you have pinned, make sure that you have a mirrored pair, and then it's time to stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, and then finish the seams. That's what it should look like now. And now take your front piece. It's laying with wrong fabric side facing out. You can see the side seams here, and I have turned the sleeves right side out so you cannot see the seam here. At the side of your sleeve you will find a marking which will match up with the marking at the front armhole. And now slide the sleeve into your bodice so that right fabric sides are facing. Match up the side seam with the sleeve seam and match up the marking at the front armhole with the side marking on your sleeve. Last but not least, match up the marking on top of your sleeve head with your shoulder seam, and then you can simply pin the sleeve into the armhole all the way around. Pin each sleeve into the respective armhole, and once you have pinned both, it's time to stitch. We're stitching all the way around with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I will also finish the seams. Now take both color pieces and place them with right fabric sides facing, pin along the long upper edge and along the short sides. Now we're going to stitch with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and here you will find corners again, and as always I will leave the needle in the fabric as soon as I reach the corner. Then I lift the presser foot, rotate and continue sewing. Since the sewing needle remains in the fabric as you lift your presser foot and rotate your color, nothing can shift anymore, and this way you will get nice and sharp corners. That's what it will look like now. Trim off the corners and make sure not to catch the seam. Then it's time to turn the collar right side out. The reinforced side is now laying on top, and then you can form the corners nicely. I like to use my scissors to do so. As we're going to top stitch the collar, I'm going to pin everything in place along the upper and the side edges. The reinforced collar should be now laying on top. And now it's time to top stitch. I'm stitching with a small distance of 2 to 3 millimeters, and the reinforced collar is laying on top. Here are corners again, so as always I'm leaving my needle in the fabric as soon as I reach the corner. Lift my presser foot, rotate the fabric and continue sewing to get a nice and sharp corner. That's our color so far, and we will now give it a press. Now this is our color, and we will place it so that the reinforced side is facing towards the table. Now I'm going to fold it in half lengthwise. The reinforced color is basically on the outside, and I'm pinning the whole color lengthwise in half. Now you can see that the other color, which is not reinforced, protrudes a little bit by a few millimeters. Later when you're wearing your color, it is not laying flat, and we are basically now imitating the final shape of the color, and by doing so the fit will be much better and more professional. Once you have pinned the whole color in half, we are going to stitch 2 layers together at the lower edge of your color. It's a bit fumbly, but we are basically stitching 2 layers of fabric together so that the protruding color cannot shift anymore and that the color stay in its current shape. That's what it will look like. We have now secured everything, and you can see how the color that we haven't reinforced is protruding. Now you can remove the pins, but also mark the one which will be later on the outside with a pin. It's the one that we have reinforced, and then simply cut off the excess fabric along the edge so that both edges are laying flush. We now have to press the seam allowance at the lower edge of the collar stand 0.7 centimeters to the wrong fabric side, which is not possible because the curve is too strong here. That's why we're using a little trick. We simply sew the 2 collar stands together along the lower edge so we can press the seam allowances open and unpick the seam again. So simply pin both collar strands together along the lower edge, right sides facing, and now we're going to stitch. I'm stitching with a very long straight stitch and 0.7 centimeter seam allowance, and very important, at the beginning and the end of the seam I will not back stitch because I'm going to unpick the seam in a bit. And now step by step we can press the seam allowances open. I prefer to press from the right fabric side so that I don't melt my interfacing. That's what it will look like, and now I'm going to unpick the seam again. I'm cutting here, but it's always better to pull the thread out step by step so you don't have too many loose ends. Now first I'm taking the color stand that I have reinforced and place it with right fabric side facing up. And now I'm taking my color. Here is the side which is also reinforced, and this side is now being pinned to the color stand, right fabric sides facing. Match up the center marking, and there are also two markings at the color stand, and the end of the color will meet those. Basically, I'm pinning the reinforced side of the color and the reinforced side of the color stand together. Now that's what it will look like. And now we're gonna grab the second color stand and we will place it on top so that the right fabric sides are facing and the color is sandwiched right between both color stands. I'm pinning along the upper edge but also along the sides where only the color stands meet. I will start and end 1 centimeter away from the edge, so I will measure that point and put a pin in here as a marking. I will do that on both sides. You can also sew from edge to edge, but I find this method a little bit easier. So basically I'm starting at the green, pin and sew right until the rose colored one. Here I'm stitching with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now here is my color so far. I will now trim back the seam allowance to 1/2 centimeter and then I will turn the color right side out. Now take your bodice and place it with right fabric side facing up. Here you can see the neck, and now we're going to pin one of the two collar stands right sides facing to the neck. I will pin the collar stand which is not reinforced to my neck. At the front I will fold and hold the seam allowance like this, and the resulting edge will lay flush with my front edge. Pin everything in place. And then pin the rest of the collar stand to the neck. That's what it will look like, and here you can see one more time how it looks at the front. I folded in the seam allowance at the side of the collar stand and the resulting edge is laying flush with my front edge. Now it's time to stitch. I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. As we have pressed the seam allowances of the collar stand 0.7 centimeters to the wrong fabric side, you should now be sewing a little bit to the left of the crease. Later when we will pin the second collar stand to the neck, it should protrude our seam by 3 millimeters. That's what it will look like. Here you can see how the front edges are laying flush. And now I'm pressing the seam allowances upwards right into the collar stand. Now fold down the second collar stand and pin it in place too. This should be quite easy as we have already pre-pressed the seam allowances. This collar stand should cover and protrude the seam by around 3 millimeters. If it's a little bit more or less, it's not a big problem. At the front, I'm holding the seam allowance so that it stays in place, and then I will wrap it around my seam so everything is covered, and then I will simply pin it in place. That's what it will look like. I will show it at the other side as well so you can see it one more time. Here you can see the front one more time. I'm holding the seam allowance so that it stays in place, like so. And then I will wrap it around my seam so everything is covered, and then I will simply pin it in place. Once you have pinned the collar stand in place, we are going to pin along the upper edge as well. To do so, I like to pull at the collar so that the seam comes out and is laying nice and flat. And last but not least, I'm pinning along the front edges, along the curves of the collar stands as well. Now it's time to stitch. I like to start at the center back because this is barely visible, and if you start at the front you might get some ugly knots. I'm stitching right at the collar stand with a regular straight stitch and a distance to the edge of around 2 millimeters, and I'm stitching on the inside. Usually we always stitch from the outside because that is normally the seam that we will see, but here the inside seam is more visible than the outside. That's why we are stitching on the inside. And once we have reached the front, we are going to leave the needle in the fabric, lift our presser foot and rotate the fabric, and then we are going to continue sewing. This way we will get a nice tip at the front. To hem, we need to fold the hem twice, 0.5 centimeters to the wrong fabric side, and pin and stitch it in place. As the hem is a little bit curved and I don't like to pin those little seam allowances, I'm using a little trick. I simply run a stitch along the hem 0.5 centimeter away from the edge. This method is very fast and requires no pinning. That's what it will look like. And now we can fold the seam allowances 0.5 centimeter to the wrong fabric side and stitch it in place. We are basically folding it right at our seam. I usually do this step by step and I don't pin it, but you can also use a few pins if you feel insecure. And now I'm going to repeat this step one more time. I'm folding my hem half a centimeter to the wrong fabric side and stitch it in place with a little distance to the edge of around 3 to 4 millimeters. This is our result, a small neat hem, and it's very likely that it is now a little bit wavy. That's why I'm pressing it flat. To hem the sleeves, I will first finish them all the way around using my overlocker. As always, you can also use your regular sewing machine and a large zigzag stitch. Next, I'm going to fold it 2 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place all the way around, and then I will repeat this step with my other sleeve as well. Now it's time to stitch. I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and to 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and after I stitched I will give them a final press. Next I'm going to install the buttonholes. I usually sew those to the left side, which is the one without a pocket, and every sewing machine has its own way to do it, so I would recommend to look into the instructions of your sewing machine and see how you can sew on the buttonholes. The buttonholes are always 1.5 centimeters away from the front edge, and you might want to check the length in case you're using a very large or special button. Basically, the length of the buttonhole should be the diameter of your button plus twice its height. Now that's what it will look like. We are now going to cut the buttonholes open. Make sure not to cut into the seam. Now we need to determine the final position of the buttons. I pin both button plackets together so that they overlap by 3 centimeters. And then I can simply draw a marking right at the center of each buttonhole to check the final position. As you can see, the final position of my buttons is not where my initial marking was. Here you can see how important it is to check the final positions. Apparently my buttonholes are too close to the front edge. This can easily happen and is not a big problem. Now we only need to sew on the buttons. Use a hand sewing needle and thread in the same color as your buttons. I always start at the right side, at the outside of my shirt, and leave the thread end there. Then I will sew on the button with a few stitches. And once your button is secure, I will push my needle through the fabric so that it comes out right between the button and the button placket and is now laying on the same side as my thread end. I will then wrap it around my button 2 to 3 times, and then you can simply knot the thread ends and cut the thread off right beneath the button.